The Appalachian hunter who forced his daughters into his bed. Benjamin's horrifying secret. 1990, West Virginia. A hunting ledger behind a wood stove, a column marked Nights Kept. 3 daughters who vanished the year their father fell silent. I'm Clara Boone, and I found that ledger 31 years later in a foreclosed cabin where neighbors once heard screams they mistook for foxes. The sheriff back then was kin to Benjamin Harper. No welfare checks, no questions asked, just miles of mountain and a family that lived too far from town for anyone to care. Then a cassette tape surfaced in a farmhouse wall. A trembling voice. Sarah Harper, age 17, speaking 1 week before her father disappeared. She described the locked doors, the night lessons, the sisters who didn't run. That spring, a sinkhole opened downstream. Inside, wrapped in hunting canvas, they found Benjamin's remains. He fell through while burying something heavy. His own trap claimed him. But the daughters were never found. Their graves are still out there, somewhere under the ridge. This is how their secret finally surfaced, through ink, tape, and stone. So when the law protects the predator and silence buries the innocent, who delivers justice, and does the mountain always remember what men choose to forget? If you're listening from halfway across the world or right here in these hills, drop a comment with where you are and what time it is. Subscribe to keep these voices alive and make sure predators are never forgotten. Winter came early to Tucker County in 2021, the kind that locks the ridges in ice and makes even the county roads feel like they belong to another century. Deputy Marcus Webb had been with the Sheriff's Department for 6 years, long enough to know that foreclosure calls in the backcountry meant mold, mice, and maybe a mattress someone had dragged outside and left to rot. The Harper cabin sat 9 miles up a logging road that hadn't seen maintenance since the 90s, tucked into a hollow where the pines grew so thick that noon looked like dusk. The bank had finally claimed it after decades of back taxes, and Marcus drew the short straw to inventory whatever was left before they bulldozed it come spring. He pulled up in his cruiser just after 10 in the morning, boots crunching on frozen ground, breath clouding in air so cold it hurt to breathe. The cabin itself was small, maybe 600 square feet, with a sagging porch and windows so filthy they looked painted black. Marcus had grown up in these mountains, knew a dozen places just like this, where men lived alone and died alone, and nobody found them until the smell drifted down to the nearest neighbor. But this one had a stillness that felt different, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. He jimmied the front door with a crowbar, the old wood giving way with a crack that echoed across the hollow, and stepped inside. The smell hit him first, not death. Exactly, but the musty rot of abandonment, of years piled on years without fresh air or sunlight. The main room was sparse, a wooden table with 3 chairs, one of them child-sized, a cast-iron stove in the corner, its pipe rusted through, shelves lined with mason jars, most of them empty, a few still holding what might have been preserves once, but now looked like something diseased. Marcus pulled out his phone to snap photos for the report, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, and that was when he noticed the discoloration on the floor near the stove. The boards there were cleaner than the rest, as if someone had pulled them up and replaced them not too long ago, maybe a decade, maybe less. Marcus knelt down, worked his fingers into the gap, and pried one loose. Underneath, wrapped in an oil-stained cloth, was a metal lockbox about the size of a shoebox, its surface covered in rust, but still intact. He carried it outside into the light, set it on the hood of his cruiser, and used his crowbar to snap the corroded latch. Inside were Polaroids, maybe 20 of them, faded and curled at the edges. 3 girls, ranging in age from maybe 6 to 14, standing in front of this very cabin, wearing dresses that looked homemade and expressions that looked like fear. No smiles, no light in their eyes, just stillness. Beneath the photos was a leather-bound book, the kind hunters used to log their kills before everything went digital. Marcus flipped it open, saw dates going back to 1983, neat columns listing species, weights, locations. Deer, rabbit, possum, turkey. Normal enough. But then his eyes caught a column on the right-hand side, written in the same careful script, labeled Nights Kept. The entries were sporadic at first, 1 night in 83, 3 nights in 84. Then, starting in 87, the numbers climbed. 7 nights, 12 nights, 18 nights. The species column next to those entries didn't list animals. It listed names: Sarah, Ruth, Mary. Marcus felt his stomach turn. He flipped forward, watching the pattern repeat year after year, the numbers growing, the gaps between entries shrinking, until 1990, when the entries stopped altogether. The last line read, Mary, winter taken, cabin cleared. No date, no signature, just those 5 words in ink that had faded to brown. Marcus sat there on the hood of his cruiser, the wind biting through his coat, the ledger open in his hands, and tried to make sense of what he was looking at. He knew the name Harper. Everyone in Tucker County over 40 knew it. Benjamin Harper had been a hunting guide, a loner who knew the backcountry better than anyone alive, the kind of man people called when they wanted a guaranteed elk or a bear trophy. He'd vanished in 1990 after what folks said was a fall on the mountain, though no body was ever recovered. Marcus had been a kid then, too young to remember the details, but he remembered the talk, how Benjamin's wife had died young, how he raised 3 daughters out here alone, how, one winter, all of them just disappeared, and nobody asked questions because mountain families did that sometimes, packed up and left without a word. Marcus closed the ledger, slid it back into the box with the photos, and loaded everything into the trunk of his cruiser. He didn't bulldoze the cabin. He didn't file a standard foreclosure report. Instead, he drove straight to the county archives in Parsons, a squat brick building that smelled like old paper and heating oil, and asked to speak to Clara Boone. Clara wasn't official law. She wasn't a detective or a social worker or anything that came with a badge. She was a radio host, late 50s, gray hair pulled back in a bun, glasses on a chain around her neck, the kind of woman who looked like a librarian but talked like a prosecutor. She ran a weekly program called Mountain Justice, where she dug into cold cases and forgotten crimes, reading old police reports and land records on air in a voice so calm and steady it made even the worst stories feel like something you could bear. She'd lost her job at the regional paper 10 years back when the budget dried up, but she kept digging on her own time, kept asking questions nobody else wanted to ask. Marcus had listened to her show a few times, respected the way she never sensationalized, never turned suffering into entertainment. If anyone could make sense of what he'd found, it was Clara. She met him in the archives reading room, a long table under fluorescent lights, and Marcus laid out the lockbox between them. Clara didn't speak as she opened it. She studied each photo, her expression unchanging, then picked up the ledger and read through it page by page, her finger tracing the columns. When she reached the final entry, she stopped, looked up at Marcus, and said, "These girls never left the mountain, did they?" Marcus shook his head. Clara closed the ledger, set it down gently, and pulled out a notebook. "Tell me everything you know about Benjamin Harper," she said, and Marcus did. He told her about the hunting guide, the recluse, the man who could track a deer through a blizzard and find his way home in the dark. He told her about the rumors, the ones people whispered but never repeated to the law, about screams in the night that neighbors blamed on foxes, about how Benjamin never let anyone visit, about how the girls stopped going to school after their mother died. Clara wrote it all down in her careful hand, then looked at Marcus and said, "I'm going to find out what happened to Sarah, Ruth, and Mary Harper, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows their names." That was how it started. A rusted lockbox, a ledger with columns that told a story no one wanted to read, and a woman who refused to let silence stand as the final word. Clara Boone spent the next 3 weeks building a picture of the Harper girls from fragments and silence, the kind of reconstruction that required equal parts patience and stubbornness. She started with the county school records, dusty filing cabinets in the basement of the old elementary school that had closed in 2005. The clerk, a woman named Diane, who remembered Clara from her newspaper days, let her sit at a metal desk with a space heater and work through enrollment cards going back to the early 80s. Sarah Harper had attended through 4th grade, then stopped in 1984. Ruth made it to 3rd grade, disappeared from the rolls in 85. Mary never attended at all. The notation next to each withdrawal was the same, written in blue ink that had faded to gray. Homeschool, parent request, no follow-up, no welfare checks, just 3 girls erased from the system as cleanly as if they'd never existed. Clara sat there in that basement, the heater ticking beside her, and felt the familiar weight of it, the way bureaucracy and indifference conspired to let evil hide in plain sight. She'd seen it before in other cases, the pattern of small decisions that added up to something monstrous. A teacher who didn't push, a clerk who filed the form and moved on, a system that trusted parents because it was easier than asking hard questions. She made copies of everything, tucked them into her canvas bag, and drove out to the hollow where the Harper cabin sat. It was late February, the roads still icy, the trees bare and black against a sky the color of old pewter. She parked where Marcus had parked, walked the perimeter of the cabin, tried to imagine what it had been like for 3 girls growing up here, miles from town. No neighbors within shouting distance, nothing but trees and silence and a father who believed he owned them. The nearest house was 2 miles down the logging road, a single wide trailer with a wood-burning stove and a yard full of rusted truck parts. Clara knocked, waited, and when the door opened, she found herself looking at a man in his 70s with a face like old leather and eyes that didn't quite meet hers. His name was Eddie Mullins, and he'd lived on this mountain for 50 years, worked as a mechanic until his hands gave out, now survived on disability and whatever he could hunt. Clara introduced herself, explained that she was looking into the Harper family, and watched Eddie's expression close up like a door slamming shut. He said he didn't know much, said Benjamin, kept to himself, said it wasn't his business what happened up at that cabin. But Clara had been doing this long enough to know the difference between ignorance and guilt. She stood there on his porch, the wind pulling at her coat, and said, "I found a ledger. I found photos. I know what he did to those girls. And I know someone must have heard something." Eddie looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw the weight in his eyes, the kind that comes from carrying a secret too long. He invited her inside, sat her down at a kitchen table, covered in coffee rings and old newspapers, and told her what he remembered. How Benjamin used to come by sometimes back in the 80s to get his truck fixed or borrow tools. How Benjamin never talked about the girls except to say they were being raised proper, learning to trap and skin and survive the way mountain people always had. How Eddie had driven past the cabin late one night in the summer of '89 and heard screaming, high-pitched and desperate, the kind that makes your blood freeze. He'd slowed down, almost stopped, but then he'd seen Benjamin standing on the porch with a rifle across his chest, just standing there in the dark, and Eddie had kept driving. He told himself it was discipline, that mountain fathers were hard, and that was just how things were. He told himself it wasn't his place to interfere. He told himself a lot of things, and none of them made him sleep any better. Clara listened without interrupting, her notebook open, but her pen still, letting Eddie get it all out. When he finished, she asked him if he'd ever seen the girls up close. Eddie nodded. Once, he said, maybe 87 or 88, Benjamin had brought the eldest with him, Sarah, to help carry back some parts. She'd been maybe 13, 14, thin as a rail, with dark hair pulled back tight, and a way of standing that made her look smaller than she was. Eddie had tried to talk to her, asked her name, asked if she liked living on the mountain. She'd looked at her father before answering, and when she spoke, her voice was so quiet, Eddie had to lean in to hear. She said she liked the woods. She said she liked the quiet. But her eyes, Eddie said, her eyes looked like someone who'd stopped expecting rescue. Clara asked if there was anything else, any other memory, any detail that stuck with him. Eddie was quiet for a long moment, then said that Benjamin had paid him once to help move something heavy from the cabin to the old well on the property. It was winter late at night, and the thing was wrapped in canvas and tied with rope. Eddie had thought it was a hog carcass, something Benjamin had butchered and needed to dispose of, and he hadn't asked questions. They'd lowered it down the well together, and Benjamin had paid him in cash and told him to forget it. Eddie said he tried to forget it for 30 years, and it hadn't worked yet. Clara left Eddie's trailer with more than she'd come for, drove back to town, and spent the next week pulling records. She found the property deed for the Harper land, saw that the old well had been sealed with concrete in 1994 as part of a safety compliance when the county tried to sell the parcel. She found church records from a Baptist congregation 10 miles south, saw that Benjamin's wife, Anna Harper, had died in 1982 from pneumonia, and that the funeral attendance list included no children. She found an essay contest entry from 1988, sponsored by the regional library, and when she opened the file, she found a single typewritten page titled "What Freedom Means to Me" by Ruth Harper, age 11. The essay was short, maybe 200 words, and it described freedom as the feeling of walking through the woods alone, without anyone watching, without anyone telling you when to come back. The handwriting on the entry form matched the margins in the ledger, the same careful loops and slanted letters. Clara made a copy, added it to her growing file, and noted that Ruth had won 3rd place but never came to collect her ribbon. She went back to the school records, cross-referenced the dates, and built a timeline. Sarah born in 74, Ruth in 77, Mary in 80, their mother dead when Mary was 2, the girls homeschooled, isolated, invisible to everyone except their father, and then, in 1990, nothing. No death certificates, no missing persons reports, no forwarding address. Just a ledger that stopped mid-sentence and a man who disappeared into the mountain and never came back. Clara sat in her small apartment above the hardware store, surrounded by files and photos and notes, and felt the familiar mix of anger and sorrow that came with this work. She thought about Sarah and Ruth and Mary, about the childhood they should have had, and the lives they were robbed of. She thought about the system that failed them, the neighbors who heard and did nothing, the law that never came. And she made herself a promise, the same one she made in every case. Their names would be spoken, their story would be told, and the silence that buried them would be broken, no matter how long it took. Clara knew that documentation alone wouldn't be enough, not after 30 years, not without bodies or witnesses willing to speak on record. She needed to walk the ground herself, needed to see what Benjamin had seen, needed to understand how a man could make 3 daughters vanish and have an entire county look the other way. So, in early March, when the snow finally melted enough to make the logging roads passable, she loaded her truck with a thermos of coffee, her tape recorder, and a topographic map marked with every property line and landmark she'd found in the county records. She drove out to the Harper cabin at dawn, parked in the clearing, and started walking the perimeter with the kind of methodical attention she'd learned from years of investigative work. The cabin sat in a natural bowl, surrounded by ridges on 3 sides, with only one road in and out. From the porch, you could see anyone coming from half a mile away. It was a fortress disguised as poverty, a place designed for control. Behind the cabin, maybe 50 yards into the trees, Clara found the well. It was exactly where the property map said it would be, a circular stone structure about 4 feet across, its opening sealed with a concrete cap that had cracked with age and weather. She knelt beside it, ran her fingers along the edges, and tried to imagine what Eddie Mullins had helped lower down here in the winter of 89 or 90. The well was deep, at least 30 feet, based on the echo when she dropped a pebble through one of the cracks, and the sound of it hitting water came back hollow and distant. Clara sat there for a long time, the morning light filtering through the bare branches, and felt the weight of what this place represented. Not just a crime scene, but a tomb that no one had bothered to open. She spent the rest of that day knocking on doors, what few doors there were in this part of the county. Most people didn't want to talk, either because they didn't remember the Harpers or because they remembered too much and had spent 3 decades trying to forget. But Clara had a way of presenting herself that made refusal feel like complicity, a quiet insistence that said the truth mattered whether it was convenient or not. By late afternoon, she'd collected a handful of stories, fragments that didn't quite fit together, but suggested a pattern. A woman named Judith, who'd worked at the post office in the 80s, remembered Benjamin picking up packages, always alone, always paid in cash. She said he ordered girls' clothing from catalogs, sizes that got bigger every year, but she never saw the girls themselves. A man named Harold, who'd hunted these woods for 40 years, said he'd run into Benjamin once back in 88, and Benjamin had told him in no uncertain terms to stay off his land, had made it clear with the way he held his rifle that trespassing wouldn't be tolerated. Harold said there was something in Benjamin's eyes that day, something cold and possessive like a wolf guarding a kill. The last stop Clara made was the county clerk's office in Parsons, where she asked to see the case files from 1990, specifically anything related to Benjamin Harper or missing persons reports. The clerk, a middle-aged man with the defeated air of someone who'd worked in government too long, told her there were no missing persons reports for the Harper girls. Clara asked why not, and the clerk shrugged, said that if no one filed a report, there was no case to open. Clara asked who the sheriff had been in 1990, and the clerk hesitated before answering. His name was Amos Klein, and he'd served from 86 to 98, died of a heart attack in 2003. Clara asked if Klein had been related to Benjamin Harper, and the clerk looked uncomfortable, said they were cousins on their mother's side, said it was common in these parts for families to be connected 6 different ways. Clara made a note of that, thanked the clerk, and walked out into the cold March afternoon, feeling the familiar burn of anger that came from understanding how easily the powerful protected their own. She went back to her apartment, spread her notes across the kitchen table, and started drafting a script for her radio show. But before she could finish, her phone rang. It was Marcus Webb, the deputy who'd found the lockbox, and he sounded shaken. He said a renovation crew working on an old farmhouse about 5 miles from the Harper cabin had found something in the walls, something Clara needed to hear. She met him at the property an hour later, the sun setting behind the ridges, casting long shadows across the yard. The farmhouse was a 2-story clapboard structure that had been abandoned for years, recently bought by a couple from out of state who planned to fix it up as a vacation rental. They'd been pulling down old plaster in one of the upstairs bedrooms when they found a cassette tape tucked into a gap between the studs, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag to keep it dry. The tape was labeled in careful handwriting, Sarah Confession. Marcus had already listened to it once, sitting in his cruiser with the heater running, and he told Clara he couldn't listen to it again, not without someone else there to witness it. They sat in Clara's truck, the dome light on, and Clara slid the tape into an old portable player she kept for interviewing. The sound quality was poor, full of hiss and static, but the voice that came through was unmistakable, young, trembling, careful. It started with an introduction, as if the girl was speaking to someone specific, maybe a teacher or a social worker. My name is Sarah Harper. I'm 17 years old. This is April 12th, 1990. If you're hearing this, it means I got out, or it means I didn't, and someone found it anyway. There was a long pause, the sound of breathing, and then the story began. Sarah described the cabin, the isolation, the way their father changed after their mother died. She said he told them the world outside was dangerous, that men would hurt them worse than he ever could, that staying with him was the only way to be safe. She described the locked doors at night, the way he'd come to their rooms and say he was teaching them what they needed to know, that this was how families survived in the mountains. She said Ruth tried to run once when she was 12, made it as far as the logging road before Benjamin tracked her down and brought her back. Sarah's voice cracked when she said that Ruth was never the same after that something inside her went quiet and never woke up again. She talked about Mary, the youngest, who'd been 6 when it started and didn't know there was any other way to live. And then Sarah said something that made Clara's blood freeze. She said she was planning to run that night, that she'd been hiding food and clothes for weeks, that she was going to follow the creek south until she hit the highway. She said she couldn't take her sisters because they were too scared, because Mary was too young, and Ruth wouldn't leave. And then, just before the tape ended, there was the sound of a door opening, heavy footsteps, and a voice, Benjamin's voice, asking what she was doing. The tape cut off with the sharp crack of something. Breaking, maybe the recorder itself, and then silence. Clara sat in the truck, the tape player still humming, and looked at Marcus. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw tight, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "She got out," he said. "She had to have gotten out, or the tape wouldn't be here." Clara nodded, but she didn't feel the relief she should have felt. She was thinking about Ruth and Mary, about the 2 girls who didn't run, about what happened to them in the days and weeks after Sarah disappeared. She ejected the tape, handled it carefully, and told Marcus they needed to get it to someone who could enhance the audio, who could pull every detail from those final seconds. But more than that, Clara knew she needed to find out if Sarah Harper was still alive, if somewhere out there, a woman in her late 40s was living under a different name, carrying the weight of what she'd survived and what she'd left behind. The tape was evidence, but it was also an accusation, a voice from the past demanding that someone finally listen and act. Clara spent the next week chasing a ghost through databases and records that spanned 3 decades and 4 states. She started with Kentucky, where the tape had been recorded in April of 1990, cross-referencing emergency room admissions, Jane Doe reports, and shelter intake logs from that spring and summer. The work was tedious, the kind that required calling small-town hospitals and police departments and convincing tired clerks to pull files from storage, but Clara had learned long ago that persistence mattered more than brilliance in this kind of investigation. On the 5th day, she found what she was looking for in a hospital record from Ashland, Kentucky, dated April 19, 1990. A Jane Doe, approximately 17 years old, treated for exposure, malnutrition, and a fractured left wrist. The attending physician's notes described her as unresponsive to questions about her identity or how she'd been injured, and the hospital had held her for 72 hours before releasing her to a women's shelter when no family came forward. Clara called the shelter, which had closed in 2008, but managed to track down the woman who'd run it, a retired social worker named Denise Carter, who now lived in Lexington. Denise remembered the girl, said she'd stayed for 6 weeks, barely spoke, spent most of her time reading donated books in the corner of the common room. She said the girl had a scar on her right forearm, shaped like a crescent, the kind you get from a knife or broken glass, and that she'd eventually given a name, Sarah Mitchell, though Denise had suspected it wasn't real. The girl had left in early June with a bus ticket to Cincinnati and $50 in cash, and Denise never heard from her again. Clara asked if there were any records, any photos, anything that might help identify her now. Denise said the shelter had kept minimal paperwork, mostly to protect the women who stayed there, but she thought she might have a group photo from a 4th of July cookout in '90 if Clara wanted to drive up and look through her old albums. Clara made the drive the next morning, 4 hours through winding mountain roads, and then the flat stretch of interstate that led to Lexington. Denise lived in a small brick ranch with a garden out front and the kind of comfortable clutter that came from a long life spent caring about people. She brought out 3 photo albums, sat Clara down at her dining room table with tea and cookies, and walked her through the summer of 1990. The photos were informal, snapshots taken with a disposable camera, women of all ages gathered around picnic tables or sitting on a porch. And there, in the 3rd album, Clara found her. A thin girl with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, standing at the edge of a group, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression cautious but not quite afraid. The scar on her forearm was visible, a pale crescent against tanned skin. Denise pointed at the photo and said, "That's Sarah," or whatever her real name was. She never smiled, not once the whole time she was with us, but she was polite, always said thank you, always cleaned up after herself. I got the sense she'd been trained to be invisible. Clara asked if she could borrow the photo to have it digitized, and Denise agreed, said she hoped it would help, that she'd thought about that girl often over the years, and wondered if she'd made it. Clara drove back to West Virginia with the photo on the seat beside her, and when she got home, she scanned it and sent it to a contact at the state police, a detective who specialized in cold cases and owed her a favor from a story she'd helped break 5 years earlier. The detective ran the image through facial recognition software, cross-referenced it with driver's license photos and employment records, and 3 days later called Clara with a name. Sarah Mitchell, now Sarah Brennan, age 47, living in Columbus, Ohio, working as a librarian at a community college. No criminal record, no marriage license, no children. A quiet life, the kind that suggested someone who'd decided the best way to survive was to never be noticed. Clara sat with that information for a long time, weighing whether to reach out, whether opening this door would help or harm. She thought about what Sarah had already survived, the courage it had taken to run, the guilt she must have carried for leaving her sisters behind. In the end, Clara decided that Sarah deserved to know that someone had finally listened to her tape, that the silence had been broken, that her story mattered. She wrote a letter, careful and respectful, explaining who she was and what she'd found, and mailed it to the Columbus address with a return envelope and her phone number. 2 weeks passed with no response, and Clara had almost given up hope when her phone rang late on a Thursday night. The team voice on the other end was quiet, controlled, but Clara recognized it from the tape. Sarah said she'd received the letter, said she'd read it a dozen times, said she didn't know if she could talk about what happened, but that she needed to know if her sisters had been found. Clara told her the truth, that there were no bodies, no graves, no official record of what happened to Ruth and Mary after April of 1990. Sarah was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with tears. She said she'd spent 31 years hoping they'd somehow gotten out too, that maybe they'd run after she did, that maybe they were living quiet lives somewhere under different names. But she'd always known the truth, had known it the moment she heard the gunshot as she ran through the woods that night, had known it every day since. She said Benjamin told them once that if any of them tried to leave, he'd make sure the others paid the price. She said she ran anyway because staying meant dying slowly, and she'd thought that maybe, if she got out, she could send help back. But by the time she'd made it to Kentucky, by the time she'd healed enough to think clearly, she'd been too afraid to go to the police, afraid they wouldn't believe her, afraid Benjamin would find her, afraid that speaking up would only confirm what she already knew, that Ruth and Mary were gone, and it was her fault for leaving them. Clara listened without interrupting, let Sarah get it all out. And when she finally spoke, she told Sarah what she'd learned about Benjamin, about the ledger, about the well, about Sheriff Klein's connection to the family, and the way the system had failed all 3 of them long before Sarah ever ran. She told Sarah that none of this was her fault, that survival wasn't betrayal, that the only person responsible for what happened in that cabin was Benjamin Harper. Sarah cried then, really cried, and Clara stayed on the line, letting the silence hold what words couldn't. When Sarah finally composed herself, she said she'd testify if it came to that, said she'd speak on record, said she wanted the world to know that Ruth and Mary existed, that they mattered, that they deserved better than to be forgotten in an unmarked grave on a mountain no one cared about. Clara promised her that would happen, that their names would be spoken, that justice, however delayed, would come. After they hung up, Clara sat in her kitchen with the lights off, the weight of the conversation settling over her like a physical thing. She thought about the tape, about Sarah's voice at 17 saying, "He said no man would find him, but the mountain sees." And Clara realized that Sarah had been right. The mountain had seen. The mountain had kept the evidence. And now, finally, the mountain was ready to give up its dead. Spring came late to Tucker County in 2021, the kind of spring that melts the high snow and sends water rushing down every creek and hollow, carving new paths through soil that's been frozen for months. Clara had compiled everything she'd found into a single file, thick enough that it required 2 rubber bands to hold together, and she'd delivered copies to the state police, the county prosecutor, and the FBI field office in Charleston. She'd also prepared a special broadcast for her radio show, a 2-hour episode that would lay out the entire case, complete with excerpts from the Ledger, testimony from Eddie Mullins and Sarah Brennan, and a detailed timeline of how Benjamin Harper had brutalized his daughters for nearly a decade, while law enforcement looked the other way. The broadcast was scheduled for April 12th, the 31st anniversary of the day Sarah had recorded her confession and run for her life. But 3 days before it was set to air, Clara got a call from a hunter named Tom Vickers, who'd been tracking a wounded buck through the woods downstream from the old Harper property. Tom said he'd been following a game trail when the ground beneath him gave way, not completely, but enough that he'd had to grab onto a tree root to keep from falling into what looked like a sinkhole that had opened up after the spring melt. He'd shined his flashlight down into the hole and seen something that made him climb back up and call the sheriff immediately. Canvas. Old hunting canvas, the kind that had been used for decades before nylon became common, wrapped around something large and secured with rope that had mostly rotted away. The sheriff's department sent a recovery team out that afternoon, and by evening they'd excavated what Tom had found. It was human remains, or what was left of them, after 31 years in wet limestone soil. The bones were still partially wrapped in the canvas, which bore a tag with a name stitched into the corner, B. Harper. The forensic team noted that the skeleton was intact, except for significant trauma to the left leg and pelvis, consistent with a fall from height, and that the position of the remains suggested the person had been alive when they went into the ground, possibly trapped and unable to climb out. Clara drove out to the site the next morning with Marcus Webb, and they stood at the edge of the sinkhole while the forensic crew worked below. The hole was maybe 15 feet deep and twice as wide, hidden by overgrowth until the spring runoff had undermined the soil and caused the collapse. From the positioning, it appeared that Benjamin had been walking along what used to be a narrow ridge between the creek and a limestone outcrop when the ground gave way beneath him. The lead investigator, a woman named Dr. Patricia Moss, told Clara that sinkholes were common in this region, that the whole mountain was honeycombed with limestone caves and underground streams, and that it was entirely possible Benjamin had fallen through while moving something heavy, maybe trying to dispose of evidence in the creek. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The hunter had become the hunted, caught in a trap of his own making, buried by the same mountain he'd used to hide his crimes. Clara asked if there was any indication of what Benjamin might have been carrying when he fell, and Dr. Moss pointed to several scattered bones near the edge of the sinkhole, smaller, consistent with a young person, possibly female, possibly adolescent. The team would need weeks to properly excavate and analyze everything, but the preliminary assessment was that Benjamin had been in the process of moving at least one body when the ground collapsed. Clara felt her throat tighten. Ruth or Mary, or maybe both, reduced to scattered remains in a hidden grave that even their killer hadn't been able to finish. The mountain had stopped him midway, had swallowed him whole, and had kept that secret for 3 decades until the spring melt finally revealed what silence had buried. The story broke within hours, first in local news, then regional, then picked up by national outlets hungry for the kind of justice narrative that felt increasingly rare in modern America. Clara's radio broadcast aired as scheduled, and the response was overwhelming. Thousands of listeners called in, wrote letters, sent donations to help fund a proper burial for Ruth and Mary Harper once their remains were positively identified. Sarah Brennan gave a single television interview, her face shown in shadow to protect her privacy, and spoke with quiet dignity about the sisters she'd lost and the guilt she'd carried for 31 years. She said she hoped they could finally rest now, hoped that speaking their names out loud would give them the honor they'd been denied in life. The prosecutor announced that while Benjamin Harper could no longer face criminal charges, the case would remain open until all victims were accounted for and properly laid to rest. Sheriff Amos Klein's legacy was publicly dismantled, his name removed from a community center that had been dedicated in his honor, his failure to protect the Harper girls added to a growing list of cases where law enforcement had chosen family loyalty over justice. Clara recorded her closing segment for the broadcast on a warm May afternoon, sitting on the porch of the old Harper cabin with her microphone and the sound of wind moving through new leaves. She talked about the ledger, the tape, the sinkhole, and the way all of it had come together to tell a story that demanded to be heard. She talked about Sarah's courage, Eddie's burden of guilt, and the systems that had failed 3 innocent girls. And then she said the words she'd been crafting in her mind for weeks, the summation that would close this chapter and open space for whatever healing could come. Benjamin Harper believed he could own his daughters, that isolation and fear would keep his secret safe, that the mountain would protect him the way it had protected men like him for generations. But he was wrong. The mountain doesn't protect predators. It buries them. And when the time is right, when the snow melts and the ground shifts, the mountain gives back what it was owed. He buried Ruth and Mary in silence, and silence buried him. That's the balance of the hills. That's the justice that comes when men fail and the land remembers. The forensic analysis took 3 months to complete. The remains found in the sinkhole were confirmed as Benjamin Harper, cause of death, determined to be massive internal trauma and exposure following a fall. The smaller bones were identified as 2 females, one approximately 14 years old, one approximately 11, consistent with the ages Ruth and Mary Harper would have been in the spring of 1990. DNA samples were impossible to obtain after so many years in wet soil, but dental records pulled from the old elementary school matched the youngest remains to Mary Harper. Ruth was identified through bone measurements and the presence of a healed fracture in her right arm, consistent with medical records from when she'd been treated at age 8 for a fall. The girls were buried together in a small cemetery outside Parsons, with a headstone that bore their names, their dates of birth, and a single line chosen by Sarah: "Beloved daughters, freed at last." The funeral was attended by more than 200 people, most of them strangers who'd heard Clara's broadcast and felt compelled to bear witness. Sarah stood at the graveside with Clara beside her, and when it came time to speak, she said only, "I'm sorry I left you. I'm sorry it took so long, but everyone knows your names now. Everyone knows you mattered." Clara's final broadcast on the Harper case ended with a question, the same one she asked at the end of every investigation, the one that invited listeners to sit with the moral weight of what they'd heard. Was it God, fate, or just the mountain giving back what it was owed? You decide. But Clara already knew her answer. Justice, when it finally came, didn't always look like a courtroom or a verdict. Sometimes it looked like a sinkhole opening in the spring, like a tape recording hidden in a wall, like a woman who refused to let silence stand as the final word. Sometimes justice was slow and imperfect and came too late to save everyone. But it came. And that, Clara thought, was enough.